Hi, my name is Mark Jobson, and today we're going to have a high-level look at the security aspects of the 802.11 standard. What we're going to go through is how the standard's evolved, the basic connection methods, and then we will look at how we create a secure encrypted connection on top of this. Finally, we'll take a look at a couple of the major vulnerabilities and what we can expect from the new WPA3 release. So, a little bit of history. In the beginning, we had WEP, and it was based off the RC4 encryption method. It was the IEEE's attempt to include at least the same level of security as a wired network, hence the name WEP, Wired Equivalent Privacy. Unfortunately, both WEP and the underlying RC4 encryption method were found to have a lot of problems. And if you're using it anywhere, in your office or your home for that matter, you should stop. It was dropped from the standard in 2004 and banned for use by the payment card industry in 2008 due to the ease of which it could be hacked. Short story is, WEP was broken, and it led to WPA being developed in 2003. The big thing with WPA is that it had to be backward compatible and able to be run on the same hardware. So it really only added a tunneling protocol known as TKIP. It still used the same RC4 encryption and still had many of the same problems. A big drawback is that they relied on all devices having the same pre-shared key. This means that a hacker just had to get that key to get access to all of your wireless LAN traffic. Probably not something your average CEO wants. At about the same time that WPA3 came out, 802.11x was released. It was with the extensible authentication protocol known as EAP. More to come on EAP later. But for now, just be aware it's a way that allows many different authentication methods to be used. At the moment, there's about 40 of them. Over the years, the standard has been updated to include new technology, and the latest release is the 2010 release. Just recently, we had WPA3 released. That was in 2018. It's going to be a few years before we see a proliferation of devices out there and really able to take advantage of that new standard. So, connect. There are two methods of connection defined in the standard: open systems authentication and a shared key authentication. You might use shared key at home, but most enterprises use open authentication, and it will become clear why we do that as we go through the presentation. As we enter an area that a wireless access point lives in, we begin to receive beacon frames from that wireless access point. These are basically advertising that it's out there. Once we get a beacon frame, we'll send a probe request from the client that's really asking, what capabilities do you have and how can we connect? The beacon, or the access point, responds with a capability statement saying, I can connect at all of these different speeds using all of these different methods. Once they have agreed on a method, the client or the station sends an authentication request to the beacon, and that's responded to with a yes, sure, you're authenticated, hence this is open or open systems connection. Once we have it authenticated, the association request goes out and the station responds with an association message. This really is the same as plugging an Ethernet cable into the socket or a switch port. You expect it to automatically connect, and it does. This doesn't mean you're connected to any of the services on the network, just that you have a layer 1 and a layer 2 connection that works. .802.11x is a standard in its own right and is a port-based access control method. In the wired world, it's used to authenticate devices plugged into switch ports. It's basically the same in the wireless world, but we're talking about access across an RF connection. The standard defines three components of the network: a supplicant or a station, an access, it could be your laptop, could be some other wireless device out there, an authenticator, and an authentication server. We also have the concept of a controlled port, shown in red, and an uncontrolled port, shown in yellow. The controlled port only allows access for EAP traffic used to authenticate the supplicant. The uncontrolled port doesn't activate until a successful EAP authentication has occurred. To achieve this, there's two real protocols used: EPOL, which is Extensible Authentication Protocol over LAN, and radius EAP. This is how they talk to each other. For 802.1x to work, we must have used open authentication. We need this to ensure that the authenticator, in our case, the access point, is invited to the authentication party. If it isn't, the 802.1x process can't start. This is the main reason we have open systems authentication as the main method used across enterprise wireless LANs. Now, in this diagram, we have our 3 devices defined by the standard, but we've also added a corporate directory. This is what you would normally see in an enterprise, and the corporate directory would be used to store all of the access credentials. The client sends an ePOL start message to the access point to begin the process. This is an optional message, and you may not always see it. Its purpose is for a client to be able to tell the authenticator that it would like to start the authentication process. Regardless if this is or isn't sent, the AP will send the client a request for its identity in an EAP request message. The client then sends back some form of identity, such as a username. Once the AP has the client's identity, it passes this onto the authentication server. Now, the authentication server might have all the credentials for the user stored locally, but most likely it's going to use LDAP and use an LDAP connection to the corporate directory. And it's going to ask the corporate directory, does this user exist? Once the corporate directory says yes, it'll send back a radius access challenge to the access point. The access point sends this challenge onto the station, asking it for authority. The client will then send back its response authorization. This could be a password or a token or any number of things, depending on what authentication method you choose. Most often, it's a password or a token. The radius server then sends this data to the corporate directory using LDAP to get confirmation you are the right person and you are authorized to connect. If it's all good, the access point will send that success onto the client, and the controlled port is open for data. Now, before we go on, we need to have a very basic understanding of cryptographic keys. You can think of a key for cryptography in the same way you can think about a key for your front door. You have a very specific key that only fits your door and gives you access to your private areas. As previously discussed, a common shared key for all clients really isn't secure. If a hacker gets your key, he will eventually find the door that it opens and have access to everything. A key in the wireless world isn't a physical key. It really is just a very long string that device uses to convert your plaintext data that you've entered into an encrypted string or ciphertext that can't be read by anyone that doesn't have the same key that you have. So what are all these keys and why do we need them? These keys provide a way for us to generate a new key for every session for every device that connects to the wireless LAN. This is the critical improvement in security, as a key is only valid, that is, it can only be used to access your private data for that specific session on that specific device. So what are the keys? You will see the MS key, or the master session key. This is also known as the AAA key, depending on what part of the 802.11i standard you read. Following on from there, we have the group master key and the pairwise master key. And then through the four-way handshake that we'll have a look at next, we use these to create a group transient key and a pairwise transient key. You'll see how all these fit in the next slide. And there's a lot of acronyms to remember. But the key thing to remember is the pairwise transient key is used to transmit unicast traffic between you and the access point, and the group transient key is used for all broadcast and multicast traffic going out to everyone connected to that access point. How does 802.1x work? Following the authentication success, the master session key is generated. This is not passed between the supplicant and your authentication server, but is generated by the radius server and the supplicant individually. It's important to note that this is only applicable to this server, this session, and is bound entirely to this session. Once the master session key has been generated by the station, the end station, and the authentication server as well, uses it to derive a pairwise master key. The authentication server moves this pairwise master key down to the access point, and the station uses it to derive new keys. This pairwise master key is not shared with any other client. Now the supplicant and the authenticator have the pairwise master keys. We can move on to the famous four-way handshake, or more accurately, the four-frame cryptographic setup. Now, for all this to work, we need to have the open systems authentication done successfully, and we need to have finished successfully the EAP authentication. Now, assuming we have both of those, we can actually start the four-way handshake. First step is that the AP sends an A nonce, or an authenticated nonce, to the station. A nonce is basically a pseudo-random number generated by the access point, because we all know that computers can't be completely random. The station has a look at this frame, checks the replay counter to make sure that the frame has not been hijacked, and if that's okay, it accepts the A nonce. Now it has the A nonce, it has its pairwise master key, it knows its own MAC, and it now has the AP MAC. It uses these to generate a pairwise transient key. Once it has that, it sends a message back to the access point, which is the S nonce, or the supplicant nonce. This again is a random number, and it's also protected by a message integrity check. Once that gets to the client, the access point, it now has all the information it needs to create its own pairwise transient key. Now, both of them have pairwise transient keys, and at no time has this been sent across the network. So it's been generated by the devices at each end. So once the access point successfully has its pairwise transient key, it sends a robust, secure network validation or verification back to the station saying, yep, I'm all good, and this message is also protected by a message integrity check. Once the station receives that, it sends back the key installation or acknowledgement frame. Now everything is set to go. We're ready to transmit secure data. But we have some smart security researchers out there that have found ways to break all of this and to get access to our secure data. Following, we'll just discuss a couple of those most famous and recent vulnerabilities. First one is crack vulnerability. For this to be able to be exploited, a hacker needs to really be able to set up a man-in-the-middle attack. Now, for any hacker or pen tester worth their salt, this is not going to be very hard to achieve. Now, if we remember back to the four-way handshake, message 3 and 4 are basically a acknowledgement frame, or acknowledgement frames. So what the hacker does is they'll intercept frame 4 and block it from arriving at the access point. Now, under the standard, the access point must then resend frame 3, and also states that new keys must be installed, and it sets the nonce to all zeros. Supplicant receives this message and responds with a new message 4. The hacker now has a data packet and a reset nonce and can therefore compute the pairwise transient keys. This gives them access to your data. The hacker can also continue to block message 4, and this will cause a continual retransmission of message 3, effectively denying service to the supplicant. Guess what? We now have a broken WPA2 protocol. The good news is that in most recent equipment and firmware upgrades, there has been a patch developed for this crack. So it's only on unpatched or older equipment that are still vulnerable. The most recent hack found is the crook vulnerability. This was only discovered by ESET in 2019, and it exploits a vulnerability in the way the encryption chips have been designed. Now, it relies on the default or standard disassociate behavior. When a chip receives a disassociate frame, it drops all session keys or deletes all session keys. And in a computer, you can't delete things. So what it does is it writes all zeros into the memory locations that stored the session keys. This is the expected behavior. Now, when this happens, the transmit buffer may still contain data that it hasn't had a chance to send yet. So what goes on is it sends this data encrypted with the all zero key. Now, all a hacker has to do is capture this data, redefine the keys, you'll redefine it, decrypt it, using the all zero keys, and they have access to your clear text data. Now, the amount of data they get can then be anywhere between 0 and 32 kilobytes, depending on at what point in time the buffer is emptied. To get more data, they just keep sending disassociate frames, and the process will continue. At the moment, they estimate that there's about 1 billion devices out there that are suffering from this vulnerability. It's any wireless device that uses the Broadcom or Cypress chipset. Still not fixed, this one. So what do we get in the future? All hope is not lost. WPA3 has been released by the Wireless Alliance in 2018, but realistically, we won't see a proliferation of devices for another few years. The good thing is it gives us better encryption through simultaneous authentication of equals, which means no more pre-shared keys. It also gives us better protection against weak passwords that could be used for off-site brute force attacks, and it does this by changing the way it uses those passwords. Also fixes a big problem that we've had in Wi-Fi protected setup and provides better encryption for enterprise users in the long run. So as these devices become more available, it'd be highly recommended to move down the WPA3 path. Hope this has given you an overview of the security aspects of wireless networks. Thank you.